Welcome to the N1 Fitness Podcast. Today I'm super excited to have Stephan Guyenet back on the show. Stephan was on episode number 5 of the podcast, educating us on why we overeat and his amazing book, The Hungry Brain. So thanks for coming back on, man.
Okay, thank you, Marcus.
So before we get into our topic today, can you just remind folks how you got into all this health and fitness and wellness stuff to begin with?
Yeah, I've been interested in health and fitness from a pretty young age. Did sports throughout high school and continued to be very physically active throughout my life, and just was always interested in understanding how to look and feel and perform as well as I could. And so I kind of brought that together with my interest in science through first by studying neuroscience and then by applying neuroscience to the study of body fatness. So understanding the brain mechanisms that regulate obesity. So that was kind of my way of bringing together my personal interests in health and fitness with my scientific interests. And then so that kind of culminated with a postdoc at the University of Washington with Mike Schwartz, obesity researcher, and then everything that I had learned from all of that, I put together into a book called The Hungry Brain that we discussed last time, and that is a book that is targeted toward a general audience.
Awesome, man. Now, you recently wrote a great article on your website that outlined how to quickly assess whether someone is a credible expert or not, which we're going to be chatting about today. So what was your inspiration or motivation to put that article together?
You know, I consider myself to be a reasonably intelligent person, but I'm not an expert in most things, right? Like, I'm not an expert in probably 99% or more of the things that I encounter in my daily life. I'm an expert in a really narrow kind of subset of topics. And so, you know, there's some things where you have to kind of trust what other people are saying to help yourself make decisions because you just don't have the time or energy to dive in enough to become an expert. So like, for example, if we're talking about investing your money, like, are you going to go and get a, economics degree to understand how to invest your money? Or are you just going to find experts who you believe and take their advice on how to do it? And basically, so we're in this situation constantly where we're making decisions based on our perception of the expertise of other people. Medical decisions is another great example. You go into the doctor's office and you're trusting the expertise of that doctor. And generally, if you want to challenge the doctor's expertise, you better have a pretty good idea of what you're doing. You better have a pretty good understanding of the topic. And so, like, let's say you see some expert on TV that says something that disagrees with your doctor. How do you know that what that person said is more credible than what your doctor said? So we're in these situations all the time where we're having to base our decisions in life on information coming from other people and having to make assessments of their level of credibility. And I see this all the time too in people who are thinking about nutrition. So like, how do I convince people that what I have to say is more credible than, somebody who has no training or experience and just set up a blog and, starts typing about their opinions? Like, how do I communicate to people that what I have to say is based on more expertise and is more reliable than that? That's the kind of thing. People are making those kinds of decisions all the time. They're encountering both sources of information and having to prioritize them. And so this is something I see a lot with my audience, like how, there's so many people making claims in the health and nutrition sphere, and so many of those claims are conflicting, and so many of those claims superficially seem quite credible. So how do we get down to it and figure out which one of these people is most likely to be telling the truth without ourselves getting, 3 PhDs in different areas of human nutrition? Over the course of observing the public health and nutrition sphere, which is an area that I have expertise in, I've been able to kind of develop these intuitions about who is providing credible information, who's providing reliable information, and who is not. There's certain features of the types of people who are providing information that's not credible. Whenever I see someone who says something that I know is incorrect in my area of expertise, there's certain features that those people tend to have. And because of that, you can kind of pick up on those and you can generalize to other situations where you don't have expertise. So that's kind of the situation. That's kind of the rationale behind what I did. And so, and there are, plenty of people who have inspired me to kind of come up with these principles. But certainly some of the, I would say, less evidence-based people in the low-carbohydrate diet community have contributed disproportionately for me kind of cutting my teeth on this. So do you want me to go through the principles?
Well, before we get into the principles, I just wanted to quickly ask you why you think, this is something that I've thought about a lot, why is it in the nutrition and health field that it seems to be disproportionate as far as folks making claims when they don't have the expertise necessarily, but when you look at something like, nobody pretends to know a bunch about fixing a car or building a bridge, for example, but in the health and nutrition field, this just seems so rampant. Now, I'm in this field, so I could just see it a lot more and I could be biased that way, but do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are a couple of reasons that come to mind for me. The first is that everybody eats. So, we have lots of experience with eating. So I think maybe that creates some perception of expertise. But the second reason is, and this is one of the principles that I outline in my post, is that the topic relates to personal identity. So food is a very important aspect of personal identity. And so and when you have topics that are closely tied to personal identity, people will tend to form tribal groups and base their beliefs about it on tribal affiliation considerations rather than evidence. And so I think that's what we see a lot in nutrition. People get very attached to their cultural way of eating, for example. Maybe their ethnic background is very strongly affecting that, and they feel maybe perhaps defensive about, people critiquing that. And then you have people who adhere to some particular dietary tribe. And I think the smaller the tribe, the greater the tribal affiliation, greater the level of tribal affiliation. So, if you look at people's profiles on Twitter, for example, in the nutrition sphere, a lot of times people will have their preferred diet on their profile. They really they prominently advertise that aspect of their lifestyles. And a lot of times you have these little, I don't know if you've noticed this, but people are putting little symbols after their name now that advertise their dietary choice.
I have noticed that. I noticed that after vegetarians and vegans, they put a little plant.
Okay, I haven't seen that one, but I've seen the V. I think that the V means vegan or maybe vegetarian. And then now there's a little C that means carnivore. So for people who are on the carnivore diet, it's like they have this need to advertise the fact that they are part of this tribe to other people who, see them and interact with them on Twitter. And I've never been a very tribal person. I never really cared about sports. Never really, I went to the University of Virginia undergrad, and our, mortal enemy is Virginia Tech for sporting reasons. And, people from Virginia Tech would always try to get me fired up and, rib me about some upcoming or former game that the two colleges played. And I would I don't care at all. But most people care. They care. They find some way to belong, and I think diet is one of the most powerful ways to belong. And so when you have that kind of potential for tribal affiliation, and when you also have people who have experience eating, they do it every day, I think that creates a kind of a scenario where you can end up having very strong opinions. And this is similar to politics, similar to religion. These are things that very strongly relate to personal identity. And so people develop very strong and not necessarily evidence-based beliefs around those things.
I'm glad that you brought up the political or, the religious aspects as well, because it's almost like someone's nutritional philosophy or the way that they eat says something about, or folks think that it says something about who that person actually is. And maybe it does say some things about that, but yeah, it goes really far into that realm. It's fascinating stuff.
Yeah, it is fascinating. And I mean, I think food is an important part of identity for a lot of people, and that's fine. I'm not going to criticize that, but I think the issue comes when that identity driven thought process causes people to kind of create an echo chamber that amplifies non-evidence based beliefs, like relating to health claims and that sort of thing. That's when it starts to get more dangerous, in my view.
Totally, man. So let's dig into this process so folks can kind of parse that out. So first on your list is, does this person have training or experience in the subject? So how would you define training and or experience for this point?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think in some areas it's kind of obvious, like, someone who is presenting themselves as an expert on nutrition and has no degree in nutrition and has no formal experience working with clients or, doing science of nutrition or anything like that. I think that's a clear case of not having training or experience. So, and I'm not saying that no one can ever gain knowledge without going through a formal training process, but I think that if you look at the people with true expertise, almost all of them have gone through a formal training process. And so even if it's possible to do it without that, I think it's just a lot less likely. I mean, for somebody to go through the years and years of hard work that it takes to get to that level of expertise, you're probably not going to do that sitting at home taking online courses. Not saying it's impossible, but it's just very, very unlikely. And so, and you're certainly not going to do it just kind of armchair surfing PubMed. So I think, and we have these people that all the time that pose as experts in nutrition or politics or economics or whatever it is. You see them on the news, you see them all over media. They're treated as experts, but they do not have training or experience. And again, I'm not saying those people can never have insights, but these are heuristics, which means a kind of general rule. It's not a strict rule that always applies and helps you 100% of the time tell an expert from a non-expert, but these are kind of rough generalizations that together can kind of help us sort the wheat from the chaff.
Right. So if somebody does have some formal education, it helps their case. It's not an absolute must, but it's looking from the outside for someone that is listening to or following this information. It's helpful if they do have some formal education behind them. Is that sort of you increase your batting average? Like it's a better scenario than someone who has zero experience. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say it increases your batting average by a lot. And it depends on the field, of course, too. Like someone who is making claims about physics, about having made some new discovery in physics that overturns everything, if they don't have a degree in physics, I'm going to say this is probably nonsense without even, bothering to dig in to what the person's talking about. But I think, to a lesser degree, that applies to pretty much every field that involves science and that has decades of science behind it.
Right. And then you made a little note in the article as well of when this is especially important when someone disagrees with the expert consensus or what the majority of the professionals in the given field are saying. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So, people who are experts, who are legitimate experts in a field and who have been working on these problems for decades and have advanced training and experience doing, for example, scientific studies, if they're scientists, they've had a lot of time to think about these questions, and they have a lot of knowledge that they can bring to bear on these questions. And so that doesn't mean they're always right, but the likelihood that someone from the outside, without the benefit of everything that they have, is going to be able to come up with something that just overturns everything these people have created. Yeah, I'm sure it's possible. I'm sure you could find examples where that's happened in history, but I think it's a lot less likely than that person just being wrong. Because, for every time that this has happened in history, and I don't know of any off the top of my head, but maybe it has, for every time that it's happened in history, there's probably thousands of times that somebody made a claim and ended up being wrong. So I think the probability, these kind of stories get attention in media because, there's not going to be a media story that says that, what we used to think about physics or what we used to think about neuroscience is still true. That's right. Boring, right? We want to hear about how it's changing, how it's being overturned. We want to hear about conflict. And that's what gets eyeballs on the page. That's what gets the clicks. And so those types of stories, those types of concepts tend to be favored in media. But the probability that they are correct is generally, I would say, pretty low.
That's a great point. Now, moving on to number 2, does he or she try to explain everything in one idea or, essentially use oversimplifications to explain a concept? Can you give us maybe an example or two here?
Yeah, absolutely. So, so there are many examples of this, but the one that comes most easily to mind for me is the idea that Gary Taubes has put forward that sugar is the primary cause of obesity and cardiovascular disease and diabetes and Alzheimer's disease and pretty much every chronic disease. This is an idea that he laid out in The Case Against Sugar, and I promise I'm not exaggerating at all. That is literally and very explicitly what he argues in that book. So that's an example of it. And really the person who made me aware of the problems with this is a psychology researcher named Philip Tetlock. And he's done some really cool work on forecasting. So basically, forecasting means trying to predict what's going to happen in the future. So he studies how do we make the best possible predictions about what's going to happen in the future, whether we're talking about, in economics to set economic policy, or if we're talking about military planning, things like that. Obviously, our ability to understand what's going to happen tomorrow or in a year is very, very important. So optimizing our methods for doing that is also very important. And so he's done tons of research on this. And basically what he's figured out is that there are certain types of people who are really good at forecasting, and there are certain types of people who are really bad at forecasting. And these people have certain features that group them together as either good forecasters or bad forecasters. And of course, just to make this point explicit, your ability to forecast depends on your knowledge of how the world works. So if you understand how the world works, you will be a good forecaster. If you do not really understand how the world works, you will be a poor forecaster. So the forecasting and knowledge of the world aspects are tightly linked. And so what he's found is that one of the things that defines people who are really bad at forecasting and thus have a poor mental model of the world is they try to explain everything with one idea. They have this kind of fixed idea of, this one factor that explains everything, and they, kind of come up with these tales about how, everything is explained by this one thing. And in contrast, if you look at the people who are really good forecasters, they have more complex models. So the world is complex. Most things are not as simple as, one substance causing all chronic disease. And so people who are able to factor in the complexity of the world into their mental model, they tend to be much better forecasters. And so Philip Tetlock refers to those people as foxes and to the other type of person as hedgehogs. So hedgehogs are the ones with one idea. And hedgehogs, another word for that is ideologue. So someone who really has a fixed idea, one idea, and they're very ideological about it, and they find ways to rationalize around, challenges or complexities to their model. And the hedgehogs are very persuasive and very effective at capturing media attention because what they're saying is very simple and clear and confident. Like, they have great faith that this one idea explains everything, and they'll talk all about it very confidently in front of a camera. Whereas someone who is a fox and has a more complex thought process, they're going to sit in front of the camera and equivocate and talk about different factors and exceptions and nuances. And the fact that they are closer to the truth doesn't really matter that much because it's not as entertaining, it's not as compelling.
Yeah, that's a really tricky thing about us as humans, is we like these sort of neatly packaged, wrapped up ideas that are very straightforward, when in reality, these complicated subjects and ideas have complicated solutions. And so it's very easy for us to sort of fall for that, these elaborate stories that are super, like you said, entertaining.
Absolutely.
So the next one on the list, number 3, is, and you kind of touched on this, is do they show nuance? So does this person make exceptions, or are these hard and fast rules? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, this is related to the previous one. And actually, I may just fold this in with the previous one, but is the person able to see exceptions to this hypothesis that they have? Are they able to see nuances with this hypothesis, maybe places where it might apply better than others? That indicates, again, a more complex, probably more accurate mental model of the world.
Yeah, I think Alan Aragon actually debated Taubes a while back, and it's possible that I'm not getting this perfectly right, but I believe he actually asked him before the debate if any evidence at all, no matter how compelling, was to come up, would you be willing to change your mind, Taubes? And I think in short, he was sort of like, no, and we'll touch back on some of the reasons for that later on in your as far as the numbered aspects go to your blog post. But yeah, Dan Party, our mutual friend, talks about strong beliefs held loosely, which I think really applies here. So,
yeah, I saw that video. I guess Martin McDonald released a little video clip of that exchange between Alan Aragon and Taubes. And yeah, it was like really quick in passing. So I don't know how much seriousness there was in it from Taubes' side. But yeah, he did say that.
Right. Okay, so moving on to number 4, are they able to change their mind? So has their opinion changed over time, or has this person sort of been saying the same thing for the last 50 years or whatever? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, usually if we're interested in a particular field, like, I'm interested in regulation of eating behavior and body fatness. That sounds like a pretty specific topic, but it actually covers a lot of ground, right? And there are a lot of different subtopics. And the evidence is always evolving on those things. And this is how it is in almost any field, and even in something that seems kind of specific probably is composed of a number of subtopics, and the evidence is evolving in some of those. And so if if you see someone who's never able to change their mind on any of those subtopics, then that suggests that they have an irrational belief system. That's just kind of a hallmark of an irrational belief system, because you should be changing your mind sometimes. It's very unlikely that none of these subtopics are going to have the underlying evidence evolving in such a way that you should be changing your mind about them if you're being evidence-based. So again, I want to emphasize these are not hard and fast rules. These are kind of general guidelines that you put together when you're evaluating somebody, and you see, how many red flags are there, and you decide how much you want to believe somebody. But I think this one is really important, because a lot of people, because of, for ego reasons, it sucks to admit you're wrong. It sucks to admit you're wrong to other people, and it sucks to admit you're wrong to yourself. And so for ego reasons, a lot of times people won't do it, even when the evidence has shifted against them, or even if it's always been against them. And there are other incentives too, like, there may be financial incentives to continuing to say the same thing. I know that, back when I was more into the low carb thing, and my writing reflected that, I really felt this phenomenon that happens and it's not just the low carb community. This is just about diets in general. But when you have these communities that have strongly held beliefs about these things, if you say things that conform to people's prevailing beliefs and flatter those beliefs, you get a lot of love, and you get, people will buy things that you're selling. People will give you just dump praise on you. So, and I've experienced that. And now that I'm not really as tied to any particular, diet community, it's something that I don't really have anymore, but I can understand the pull of it. I can definitely understand the pull of flattering people's pre-existing beliefs and continuing with these same beliefs, even when the evidence has mounted against them. But again, that's not a rational way of determining your beliefs. And so that's another way that we can separate the wheat from the chaff. Just look back at somebody's writing over time and look for any evidence that they've changed their mind on anything substantive. And if you can't find anything, then that person is probably not rational.
That's a super useful point for folks to take home. And moving on to number 5, do they lean towards conspiracy explanations or blaming the government? Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. This is one of the ones that got the most pushback when I published it, because, there are a lot of people who really like to hate on the government. And by the way, I'm not going to sit here and say that the government is always an angel and never does anything wrong. Of course, the government does do things wrong, and there should be accountability, and people should be paying attention for, creating accountability for what the government does. But that said, I think there are a lot more people, there are a lot more situations where people want to pass things off as the government's fault than situations where it actually is the government's fault. This is a really common trope in American writing. This is something that goes back hundreds of years, Americans loving to blame the government for things. It's just kind of a cultural reflex that we have. And so stories that activate that reflex are very compelling to people. Also, anytime you blame something outside of yourself, you're taking responsibility away from yourself, or you're taking that feeling of responsibility away from yourself. And that's a good feeling. So if you can say, for example, just off the top of my head, an example I'm familiar with is people like Nina Teicholz, I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name right, really place a lot of blame on the government for the low-fat diet advice of the 1980s and 1990s and 2000s. And actually, I'm not sure if it was in the 2000s, but definitely the 80s and 90s. And, they say that the government told us to eat a low-fat diet and that made us fat. And if you look at the evidence, it really doesn't support that conclusion. Our fat intake never actually declined in the United States. So it obviously is inconsistent with that line of argument, but people eat it up. They love that kind of story. It doesn't matter that the evidence doesn't support it. It makes this really nice kind of exculpatory narrative for people to feel better about themselves, and kind of plays into established tropes in American thought and writing. But fundamentally, this is a general guideline, not a hard rule. It could be true that the government is responsible for certain things, but I think when you see that, especially when it's tied to some kind of conspiracy, if it's tied to some kind of conspiracy, the probability that it's correct goes way down, because conspiracies tend to be improbable. But even just the government blaming, I would say when someone goes there, the probability that what they're saying is true goes down. If you don't know anything about the topic, if there's not clear evidence that it's the government's fault. And the conspiracy theory thing, I think it's kind of interesting. There was a paper that came out that I linked to in my post that looked at the probability that one could successfully have a conspiracy theory versus the number of people involved. And basically they did math on how, what's the likelihood that there'll be a leak? What's the likelihood that everyone associated with it will be able to keep the secret? And once you get above, 10 or 20 people, the likelihood goes way down that they're going to be able to successfully operate a conspiracy. So not saying that conspiracies never happen, but it's just an improbable explanation.
Now, number 6 is, do they cite evidence that isn't representative of the literature as a whole? So can you tell us more about that one?
Yeah, absolutely. So the scientific literature in 2018 is immense. It is so huge that you can find studies to support almost anything that you want to believe. And people do this all the time. I think this is one of the primary mistakes that we see in the alternative diet and lifestyle community, is that people will find some mechanism from some, maybe there's a rodent study or a human study that identified some mechanism or the biochemical mechanism, and then they'll extrapolate from that mechanism to this grand theory of human health. So that's not really how we should be thinking about evaluating evidence. So first of all, we need to be looking at empirical evidence. So not just mechanism, but when we actually directly test this hypothesis, if you found some biochemical evidence that carrots cause obesity, what happens when we actually feed people carrots? Do people get fatter? If not, then it doesn't matter what that mechanism says. So you can basically construct any story you want out of the scientific literature, but one of the most important questions we need to ask ourselves is, does this idea really represent the evidence as a whole, or did I just find some little study that maybe is a bad study, or maybe it just came to this result by chance that has a result that I like, where the rest of the literature doesn't support that? So that's where things like meta-analyses or studies of studies become useful in evaluating what the overall body of literature says. And so this is a really common thing that people do, is selectively cite the literature. They have their hypothesis. There's some study that supports it. They cite that and not other studies. And this is something that experts do a lot too. This is something that I see all the time in the scientific literature. When I'm reading review papers that are not systematic reviews or meta-analyses, you see this all the time. And so this happens with experts too, but the best experts do it less, and non-experts do it even more. So non-experts do this a ton, experts do it some, the best experts do it the least. And so that is something that we can use to gauge the level of expertise. So basically, if somebody is citing studies, just do a quick Google Scholar search. Just search for a meta-analysis on that question. Can you find, if somebody is making claims about the effects of carbohydrate on calorie expenditure, can you find a meta-analysis, and spoiler alert, there is one, that aggregates all the evidence on that into one place where you can see what the overall weight of the evidence is. And when you do that, is it consistent with what this person is saying? And if it's not consistent, then that person does not have probably the level of credibility that you would want.
As far as number 7 goes, do they portray experts that disagree with them as corrupt, stupid, or dishonest? And this might kind of tie in with the conspiracy stuff, or just more so deflecting away from the subject that's actually being talked about and making it more about a personal attack about who that person is. So can you tell us a little bit more about point number 7?
Yeah, absolutely. So this kind of defamation and ad hominem stuff is really common, especially in the alternative diet and health sphere. But you also see this a lot in politics and other places where people get really fired up. And one of the places my inspiration for this was actually a guy named Jason Fung, who's a doctor. He's an MD up in Canada.
He's a nephrologist, isn't he?
You might be right about that. Yeah, maybe he's a nephrologist, but he treats people with diabetes up in Canada, and he uses a low carb diet, among other things. And he is he feels very strongly about the benefits of low carbohydrate diet for diabetes and other things, which is fine. Like, I have no problem at all with that perspective. And I, look forward to additional research on it. The research that we do have is pretty promising. But he, he takes this very accusatory perspective toward people who disagree with him. So, at one point I was interested in checking out his work and seeing, hey, what's this guy all about? And so I found a YouTube video of him, and it was like all about how typical diabetes management by other doctors was a lie, and that they say other people will say that this, their way to manage diabetes is effective, but that's a lie. Let me tell you what it really is. And so, like, not just saying I disagree with you and here's why, but saying you are being deceptive, you're hurting patients, but you continue to do these practices. That's kind of the claim that he was making. And I was so disgusted by it that I couldn't get through the first couple slides. I just turned it off because, first of all, it's really offensive to all the doctors who are treating diabetic patients, and those patients are way better off than if they did not have medical therapy. Before we had the treatments we have today for diabetes, people were dying of diabetes all the time. You didn't survive very long. So, you could say that what we're doing today is not optimal, but to say that, doctors are hurting their patients and lying, I think that's just not plausible. It's incorrect. And then he wrote another article that was titled "The Salt Scam," and I gave him a hard time about this on Twitter. And basically, in the body of the article, he was just kind of making the case for why he doesn't think salt is bad. But using that term "scam" in the title implies that people in the research and medical community who disagree with him are being dishonest, that they know that he's right, but yet they continue to perpetuate these ideas about salt, despite the fact that, it's not benefiting patients. And that's not true. I mean, these people do think they're right. They're not trying to scam anyone. They just differ on how they interpret the evidence. And so those kind of ideas to me signal that he is not engaging rationally with other people, not engaging rationally with the evidence, that he's using irrational ad hominem rhetorical tactics to try to win the argument, to try to convince people, rather than just talking about the evidence and making an evidence-based argument. He wants people to believe, those who disagree with me are bad, they're liars, they're scammers. So don't listen to them for that reason, not necessarily just because I have this evidence-based argument. So I think that's a pretty clear sign of, when someone's making arguments that are clearly not based on rational consideration of the evidence. I think that's a pretty clear sign that they don't have the level of credibility that they should.
Yeah, that's a good way to couch it, as far as someone's not just stating the evidence that they see, but they're also sort of cutting other people down at the knees and insinuating that they're somehow lying or scamming you. That's sort of just unnecessary.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's unnecessary. If you want to make your argument, if you think you're right, then make your argument. But, slinging mud like that, there's only one reason to do that, and that's to get more attention and to be, persuade people further without having to use evidence to do so.
Right. Now, moving on to the last one, number 8, does the topic relate to personal identity, or is it otherwise highly political or controversial? And you touched on this a little bit. If someone has stake in an idea because they've written a book on the subject and maybe their income relies on the subject, and there are all these sort of downstream effects of believing this certain idea, can you give us some examples of that or how that plays out in the real world?
Yeah, sure. So, again, I think it was my dad who told me that the subjects that are most tied to personal identity and most likely to trigger irrational behavior are religion, politics, and nutrition. And I've taken that with me, and I think he's right. And those are all things that relate deeply to identity. So, so if someone, it just increases the probability that the information they're providing you is that their opinions are based on considerations of identity and tribal affiliation rather than a dispassionate consideration of the evidence. So when you hear someone talking in those topics, you have to just increase your level of concern and skepticism about whether they are being rational or not. And, I think this applies to real experts too. I'm not, all these things, or at least many of these things we've talked about, they can apply to real experts too sometimes. But I would say that they apply to real experts less often, and they apply to the best experts not very often at all. And so therefore they're useful for separating the wheat from the chaff.
Yeah, I think that's really, really important for folks to know. And as far as that whole list goes, I mean, if 4 or 5 out of those 8 jump out on the list, then it's probably a safe bet that it's worth looking more into someone and their approach and maybe their background. Now, I think that, or the whole reason why I wanted to chat with you about this, Stephan, is there's dogma out there like, for example, with Taubes, we'll say sugar is bad. It makes you fat. It's the cause of all these diseases. And if you cut it out, then you can cure all of these things. And somebody might say, well, saying that sugar is bad and someone eliminating that or at least reducing that from their diet is not harmful. It's actually helpful for somebody like that. But for me, in my case, for instance, I thought that I needed to follow a lower carbohydrate approach just to be healthy years and years ago, whereas I actually do a lot better on a more moderate carb or moderate fat approach, or even a higher carb, lower fat approach. And I sort of spun my wheels for years and years because I thought that I needed to be on a low carb diet in order to be healthy, which just wasn't true when overall calories were accounted for. So that's sort of a reason why I love your work. And I loved this idea that you have around quickly assessing whether somebody's credible, because in my case, it was really helpful for this to come to the forefront as far as, for the example of sugar.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And, I think there's a couple of things to unpack here. First of all, I'm not going to claim that your situation is typical, but there are a lot of people who are like you who do better on a higher carbohydrate diet. And I get emails from these people all the time. So I'll get emails that say pretty much exactly what you just said. They'll say, hey, I read some books by low carb folks and I was really persuaded, and I went on a low carb diet thinking that it was really important for my health and my weight. And I started to gain weight on a low carbohydrate diet. And I just wanted to thank you for, helping me understand that that's not the only way to control your body weight and be healthy, and that, it doesn't necessarily work for everybody. And I tried a low fat diet and the extra weight came off and I feel a lot better. So I get a lot of emails like that. And again, I'm not saying that that's representative of the average person, but there are a lot of people who are like that. And so I think acknowledging that there's not really a one size fits all diet is really important. But the other thing is, I think this is a great example for what we're talking about here, because if you apply these heuristics that I lay out in my blog post, you could have picked out that claim very quickly as not being credible, because the claim, by the way, that sugar is the primary cause of all of our, obesity and health problems. You could have picked that out very quickly as not being credible, because first of all, it's coming from someone who has no training or expertise in the subject. So Taubes, for example, does not have any training in any aspect of the biological sciences, has never done experiments in the field of obesity or biology in general. So really everything he knows is just from doing research for his pieces that he's written. Second, he tries to explain everything with one idea, the sugar thing. He does not show nuance. I have not been able to find evidence that he has changed his mind about anything significant. And he has, as you pointed out, he's said that he would be reluctant to do so. Again, I don't know how serious he was with that comment, but he did say it. He blames the government. So, the government did the dietary guidelines, and supposedly that's what made us eat more sugar and made us fat. He selectively cites evidence. He, at times, he's not the worst about this, but at times he has portrayed experts who disagree with him as stupid. He certainly has portrayed them in a manner that would make people think they were corrupt by talking extensively about the conflicts of interests, for example, of Ansel Keys, without talking about the conflicts of interest, the extensive conflicts of interest of his protagonist, John Yudkin. And then, of course, the topic relates to personal identity. So basically, that particular claim hits all the high notes of claims that are not credible. So that's I guess that's a great example of how, applying these criteria might help, before you're an expert in a topic, might help prevent someone from getting too caught up in a particular low quality idea.
Absolutely, man. That was a great breakdown there. Now, as we start to wrap up here, is there anything that you'd like to close with or mention that we didn't touch on regarding this topic or anything else?
The only thing I'll add is that this list is a work in progress. So just the other day, I added the portraying experts who disagree as corrupt, stupid, or dishonest. I was inspired by some of the stuff that Jason Fung has put out to add that to the list, because it kind of rung a bell that I've seen that in the past as well from others. So it's a work in progress. And as I kind of refine, as I increasingly figure out better ways to express my intuitions about kind of ferreting out who's credible and who's not, I'll continue to improve the list.
Amazing, man. Well, thanks so much for putting it together in the first place, because I think it's going to be really helpful for folks moving forward. And on that note, if folks want to learn more about you, your work, where can they find you, Stephan?
Yeah, so one place is on my website, stephanguyenet.com. And if you don't feel like spelling that, you can go to wholehealthsource.org. That'll take you to the same place. The main other place where I interact with the public is on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @WHSource. And then also you can go to my Google Scholar page if you want to see the research that I've done. I have it all organized there. And I don't publish a whole lot anymore, but every now and then I still put a paper out, and I have at least one coming in 2019.
Awesome, man. That's exciting stuff. And I'd highly recommend Stephan's blog. It's great. And that's actually where I found this information that we're chatting about today. So I'll link to all that stuff in the show notes. And I just really appreciate you taking the time to come on and share this knowledge with us, man.
Okay, my pleasure.
Awesome, guys. I'll catch you on the next episode.